The transaction happened in broad daylight, September 14, 1858, outside the Anderson County Courthouse in Palestine, Texas. James Henry Garrett, a respected cotton planter, handed over the custody of his wife, a woman whose weight had reached 347 pounds, to a horse trader named Silas Beaumont. In exchange, Garrett received one purebred Morgan stallion, valued at $600. Witnesses watched in stunned silence as both men signed documents making the exchange official, while Delilah May Garrett stood beside them, her face unreadable. The crowd expected scandal. What they got instead was far worse, because Silas Beaumont hadn't made this trade out of kindness or opportunity. He'd orchestrated the entire situation as calculated revenge against the man who'd insulted him. And what Beaumont did next, over the following months, would destroy everything James Garrett valued more than the wife he'd traded away. This is the story of the most shocking transaction in Texas history and the revenge that followed it. Before we continue with the story of how a horse trader turned one man's cruelty into the perfect vengeance, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. Stories like this one deserve to be remembered, and your engagement helps us uncover more forgotten chapters of American history. Palestine, Texas, in 1858, stood as one of Anderson County's most prosperous towns, situated along the crucial trade route between Houston and the Red River settlements. With a population nearing 2,000 souls, the town boasted 3 cotton gins, 2 banks, a courthouse built from imported limestone, and enough brick buildings along Main Street to rival cities twice its size. Wealth from cotton and timber had transformed Palestine from frontier outpost to genteel southern town in less than 2 decades, complete with a literary society, a Masonic lodge, and families whose names appeared on deeds stretching back to the Texas Republic. The Garrett family occupied a notable position in this hierarchy. James Henry Garrett had inherited 400 acres of prime bottomland from his father, along with 12 enslaved workers and a modest but respectable 2-story house built in the Greek Revival style that signaled ambition toward true planter status. At 34, James had expanded his holdings to 600 acres and increased his workforce to 18, positioning himself for entry into the county's upper echelon. He dressed well, attended the Methodist Church faithfully, and served as treasurer for the local agricultural association. His wife, Delilah May, had been born Delilah Thornton, daughter of a merchant family in nearby Crockett. Their marriage, 7 years earlier, had been considered advantageous for both families. The Thorntons gained connection to land wealth, while James acquired a substantial dowry and the social standing that came with an educated wife who could read French and play piano. Wedding guests at the Thornton home in June 1851 had remarked on what a handsome couple they made, though even then, Delilah May carried more weight than fashion deemed appropriate for a woman of 22. Over the following years, Delilah May's size had increased dramatically. Some attributed it to the stillborn twins she'd delivered in their second year of marriage, a loss that sent her into prolonged melancholy and sedentary habits. Others whispered about the cook who prepared elaborate meals that Delilah May consumed alone in the afternoon after James had returned to the fields. By 1858, Delilah May rarely left the Garrett house, spending her days in the parlor with her needlework or upstairs in her bedroom where servants brought meals on trays. Her size had become a source of gossip throughout Palestine, not just for its physical manifestation, but for what it represented about James Garrett's household management and, by extension, his fitness for the higher social circles he sought to enter. James's frustration with his domestic situation had become increasingly apparent to those who knew him. At agricultural association meetings, after several glasses of bourbon, he would complain about the burden of maintaining a household that offered him no sons, no social advantage, and increasingly, no escape from humiliation. The Thornton dowry had long since been absorbed into plantation operations. Delilah May's social connections had atrophied along with her ability to participate in county society. What remained was a woman who, in James's calculation, cost more in food and embarrassment than she contributed to his aspirations. Silas Beaumont presented an entirely different figure in Anderson County society. A horse trader who operated from a sprawling property 5 miles west of Palestine. Beaumont had arrived in Texas from Kentucky in 1852 with a reputation for identifying quality bloodlines and an uncanny ability to train difficult animals. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with the lean, weathered build of a man who spent his days in saddles and corrals rather than parlors. His voice carried a Kentucky drawl that became more pronounced when discussing horses, which was to say, most of the time. Unlike the settled planters who formed Palestine's elite, Beaumont lived in a state of perpetual motion, traveling throughout East Texas and into Louisiana, Arkansas, and the Indian Territory, buying and selling horses, sometimes gone for weeks at a time. His property reflected this itinerant lifestyle, a large barn maintained with meticulous care, several well-built corrals, and a modest house that clearly served as way station rather than home. Beaumont employed 3 men to maintain his operation during his absences. 2 handlers for the horses and 1 older black man named Abraham, who cooked and kept the house. Beaumont's business brought him into contact with every level of Anderson County society. Planters needed quality stock for field work and transportation. Common farmers required sturdy draft animals. Even the town's Presbyterian minister had purchased a gentle mare from Beaumont for his wife. This democratic approach to commerce gave Beaumont unusual social latitude. He was invited to dine at planter tables when he had horses to show, but he also drank whiskey in establishments where gentlemen feared to be seen. He attended horse races, cockfights, and the informal gatherings where business was conducted through handshakes rather than contracts. In June 1858, 3 months before the courthouse transaction, Beaumont had sold James Garrett a young gelding that proved to have a split hoof hidden beneath expert grooming. When James discovered the defect and demanded his money back, Beaumont had been in Arkansas. By the time he returned in mid-July, James had already spread word throughout the county about the horse trader's dishonesty, damaging Beaumont's reputation among the planters who formed his most profitable customer base. The incident rankled Beaumont not just for the lost business, but for what he perceived as James's misrepresentation of a transaction that Beaumont considered fair. The horse had been sold as is, and any experienced horseman should have examined the animal more carefully. Their confrontation at the Agricultural Association's summer meeting had been brief but memorable. James, surrounded by fellow planters, had loudly demanded recompense. Beaumont, standing alone, had replied that any man who couldn't properly examine a horse before purchase had no business questioning the seller's integrity. The exchange had ended with James ordering Beaumont off the property, and Beaumont responding with a smile that those present would later describe as distinctly unsettling. "I'll have satisfaction for this insult," James had declared. "Name your terms." "I'll consider the matter," Beaumont had replied, still wearing that peculiar smile, "and let you know when I've determined what constitutes fair compensation." The response had seemed odd at the time, Beaumont's Kentucky drawl making it sound almost courteous, though several men present noted the cold calculation in his eyes. In the culture of Southern honor that governed such disputes, James had essentially challenged Beaumont to name the terms of their settlement. What none of them anticipated was how literally Beaumont would interpret that invitation. Throughout August, Beaumont made inquiries around Palestine. He spoke with the Garrett family's house servants at the market, asking casual questions about the household's functioning. He visited the Thornton family in Crockett on the pretext of looking at a mare they had for sale, engaging Delilah May's father in conversation about his daughter's welfare. He attended church services at the Methodist congregation, where the Garretts worshipped, observing from the back row. To those who noticed, Beaumont appeared to be conducting research, though for what purpose remained unclear. Palestine, in that summer of 1858, existed in a state of prosperous tension. Cotton prices remained high, encouraging expansion and speculation. Political debates about Kansas and the territories consumed attention in the town's 3 newspapers. Young men formed militia companies with elaborate uniforms, drilling on Saturday afternoons in anticipation of conflicts that still seemed distant and abstract. Beneath this surface animation, the rigid hierarchies of Southern society governed every interaction, and any disruption to established order attracted intense scrutiny. Into this environment, Silas Beaumont brought a proposal that would violate every assumption about how such societies functioned. The first indication that something unusual was developing came on September 10th, When Beaumont appeared at the Garrett plantation house in mid-morning, riding a magnificent Morgan stallion that drew immediate attention from everyone who saw it. The horse stood just over 15 hands high, with a deep chest, powerful hindquarters, and a coat so dark it appeared almost black, except where sunlight revealed hints of deep mahogany. Its bloodlines were evident in every proportion. This was breeding stock worth substantial money, the kind of animal that could establish a planter's reputation for quality. James Garrett came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth, having been working in his study on plantation accounts. His expression shifted from surprise at the visitor to undisguised interest in the stallion. Beaumont sat easily in the saddle, making no move to dismount. "That's a remarkable animal," James said, descending the porch steps for a closer look. "Morgan stock?" "Sired by Woodbury," Beaumont replied, naming one of the most celebrated Morgan lines. Dam was pure Justin Morgan descent through Sherman. He's 4 years old, fully trained to saddle and harness both, temperament like silk, and he's already proven himself with 3 mares back in Kentucky. Colt sold for top dollar. James circled the horse slowly, running his hands over the stallion's legs, examining teeth, checking confirmation with the eye of someone who understood quality. The horse stood perfectly still, displaying the calm disposition that made Morgan's valuable for more than just appearance. "What's his price?" James asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the figure would exceed his current means. "I'm not here to sell him to you," Beaumont said flatly. "I'm here to offer a trade." James stepped back, confusion crossing his features. "I have nothing that would equal this animal's value." "That's a matter of perspective," Beaumont replied. "I've given considerable thought to our dispute from July and to your challenge that I name terms for satisfaction. I've determined what would constitute fair compensation for the damage you did to my reputation." "Name it then," James said, irritation creeping into his voice. "I won't stand here playing guessing games." Beaumont looked toward the house, where a curtain moved in an upstairs window. Delilah May, watching from her usual position. "I'll trade you this stallion, clear title, in exchange for your wife." The words hung in the morning air like something physical. James's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, then something more calculating. "That's absurd. You can't trade a horse for a person, for a wife." "Can't I?" Beaumont's tone remained conversational. "You and I both know that property transfers happen every day in Anderson County. Women aren't property under law, true enough, but marriages can be dissolved. Custody can be transferred. Your wife's father provided a dowry when you married, effectively a financial transaction. I'm simply proposing a different kind of exchange." "This is madness," James said. Though his voice lacked the outrage the situation seemed to warrant. No court would recognize such an arrangement. "Judge Patterson might see it differently," Beaumont said, naming the circuit judge who presided over Anderson County legal matters. "Especially if both parties consent to the arrangement. Your wife's been essentially confined to your house for 3 years now. You've made no secret of your dissatisfaction with the marriage. I'm offering you an opportunity to resolve the situation with a valuable asset to show for it." James stared at the horse trader, his mind visibly working through implications and possibilities. "Why would you want such an arrangement? This makes no sense." "My reasons are my own," Beaumont replied. "But I assure you, they're entirely practical. I maintain a household that requires management. Your wife was educated by the Thornton family. She can read, write, keep accounts, manage servants. Those are useful skills. Her current physical condition doesn't concern me. I'm offering you freedom from a situation you've complained about publicly for 2 years, plus an asset worth $600. That's more generous than you deserve, considering the damage you did to my business." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with James raising objections that Beaumont systematically addressed. The legality could be managed through creative paperwork. Delilah May's consent would be obtained. Beaumont seemed confident on this point, though he didn't explain why. The social scandal could be weathered, particularly if James emerged from the situation with a valuable stallion that would enhance rather than diminish his status. Throughout the discussion, Beaumont sat motionless on the Morgan, while James paced the yard in front of his house. Finally, James asked the question that revealed where his thinking had led. How would such an arrangement be documented? Beaumont produced a folded paper from his coat. I've already drafted terms. Judge Patterson has reviewed the language and confirmed it falls within his authority to notarize, provided both parties and your wife all sign freely. The transaction would be recorded at the courthouse as a mutual agreement dissolving your marriage and transferring custody, that's the legal term we'll use, to me in exchange for valuable consideration. The stallion's title transfers to you simultaneously. And Delilah May would agree to this? James asked, finally speaking his wife's name. Why don't we ask her? Beaumont said, dismounting for the first time. What happened inside the Garrett house over the next hour remained private, though the two house servants who were present would later provide fragmentary accounts that raised more questions than they answered. Beaumont spoke with Delilah May alone in the parlor for nearly 40 minutes while James waited in his study. When Beaumont finally emerged, he reported that Mrs. Garrett had agreed to the arrangement and would sign the necessary documents. James insisted on speaking with his wife himself, and their conversation lasted only 10 minutes. When he emerged, his face was pale but set with determination. We'll proceed, he said. But I want this done properly at the courthouse with witnesses. Agreed, Beaumont said. 4 days from now, September 14th, 10 o'clock in the morning. Bring your wife. I'll bring the horse and the documentation. The 4 days between that conversation and the courthouse meeting became a period of intense speculation throughout Palestine. Rumors began circulating by that evening, fragmentary accounts from the Garrett house servants, observations from neighbors who had seen Beaumont's extended visit, whispered theories about what kind of business transaction would require such secrecy. By September 12th, enough people knew that something unusual was planned that a small crowd began to gather outside the Anderson County Courthouse that morning, drawn by gossip and morbid curiosity. September 14th, 1858, dawned clear and hot, with the kind of oppressive humidity that made clothing stick to skin and tempers turn short. By 9:30, more than 40 people had gathered in and around the courthouse, ostensibly conducting normal business, but actually waiting to see what would unfold. Judge Patterson had cleared his morning docket, and the courthouse clerks prepared documents with unusual care, aware that whatever was recorded today would be scrutinized for years to come. James Garrett arrived at 9:45 in his best carriage, driven by one of his enslaved workers. Delilah May sat beside him, wearing a dark blue traveling dress that attempted to accommodate her size while maintaining some semblance of style. Her face showed no emotion that observers could read, neither distress nor satisfaction, just a kind of blank neutrality that made those watching uncertain about her state of mind. Silas Beaumont arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, leading the Morgan Stallion and carrying a leather document case. He wore a formal coat over his usual rough clothing, the contrast emphasizing his outsider status. Judge Patterson met all three parties in his chambers, along with 2 courthouse clerks who would serve as witnesses. The documents that were signed that morning were later described by those who saw them as the most unusual legal instruments ever processed through Anderson County. The primary contract, written in Beaumont's clear hand on heavy paper, contained precise language. James Henry Garrett agreed to dissolve his marriage to Delilah May Garrett and transfer full custody and responsibility for her welfare to Silas Beaumont. In exchange, Beaumont would transfer title to the Morgan Stallion to James Garrett, along with breeding rights and full documentation of bloodlines. Both parties acknowledged receiving valuable consideration in the exchange. A separate document signed by Delilah May alone stated her consent to the arrangement and her voluntary acceptance of Beaumont's custody and protection. The language carefully avoided specific terms that might make the arrangement legally challengeable, while still creating a binding agreement that all parties understood. Judge Patterson notarized both documents after questioning each signer individually about their free consent. His face throughout the proceeding remained professionally neutral, though several witnesses later reported that his hand hesitated before applying his seal to the papers. The entire proceeding lasted less than 30 minutes. When the parties emerged from the courthouse, James Garrett held the Morgan's lead rope while Silas Beaumont stood beside Delilah May. The crowd that had gathered watched in shocked silence as the exchange was completed on the courthouse steps in full daylight, as public and official as any property transaction in Anderson County history. James mounted the Morgan and rode away without looking back at his former wife. Beaumont helped Delilah May into a wagon he'd brought for the purpose, then drove west toward his property. The crowd dispersed slowly, people speaking in hushed voices about what they'd witnessed, uncertain whether they'd seen a scandal, a tragedy, or something so far outside normal social bounds that no familiar category could contain it. The Palestine newspaper printed nothing about the transaction. The county's social elite closed ranks around the Garrett name, treating the matter as something too unseemly to acknowledge. But in kitchens and workshops, in the market square and at the Cotton Gin, people talked about nothing else for weeks. Some called it the most shameful moment in Anderson County history. Others saw it as a kind of rough frontier justice. Beaumont taking satisfaction for the insult James had delivered. Almost no one in those first weeks considered what Delilah May Garrett thought about the arrangement, and almost no one anticipated what was about to unfold on Silas Beaumont's property west of town. The 5 miles between the Palestine courthouse and Silas Beaumont's property seemed to stretch far longer in Delilah May's perception. She sat beside Beaumont in the wagon, her hands folded in her lap, watching the familiar landscape pass. Cotton fields she'd driven past countless times, the Hutchins farm where she'd once attended a quilting bee, the crossroads where the Palestine road intersected with the old Indian trace. Everything looked exactly as it always had, yet she was traveling through it as an entirely different person than she'd been that morning. Beaumont said nothing during the ride, his attention on the horses and the road. Delilah May appreciated the silence. The events of the past 4 days had left her drained of words, though not of thought. Her mind continued working through what had happened and what was about to happen, testing the boundaries of her new situation like someone learning to walk after a long illness. When Beaumont had first approached her in the Garrett parlor 4 days earlier, Delilah May had been sitting by the window with needlework in her lap, the same position she occupied most afternoons. She'd heard his voice downstairs speaking with James, then the house servant had summoned her to receive a visitor. Her immediate assumption had been that some crisis required her attention, possibly related to James's business affairs. Instead, Beaumont had presented his proposal with the same straightforward manner he might use to discuss horse breeding. He wanted to trade a stallion for her. James had challenged him to name terms for satisfaction, and these were his terms. The arrangement would be entirely legal and properly documented. Most importantly, and this was the point where Beaumont's voice had taken on an intensity that made Delilah May focus completely on his words, the arrangement offered her something she'd lost 3 years ago, agency over her own life. "Your husband confines you to this house," Beaumont had said. "Treats you like an embarrassment he can't solve. You have education, intelligence, capabilities he doesn't value because he can only see your size. I'm offering you the opportunity to use those capabilities in managing my household and business affairs. You'll work, Mrs. Garrett. You'll be useful. That's more than your current situation provides." The conversation had lasted 40 minutes, and by the end of it, Delilah May had asked only one substantive question. "What do you gain from this arrangement?" Beaumont's answer had been simple, and she sensed truthful. "Satisfaction. Your husband insulted me publicly and damaged my business, taking away what he considers a burden while making him acknowledge the transaction publicly. That's worth more to me than money." Now, as they approached Beaumont's property, Delilah May saw it with fresh eyes. The house was smaller than she'd expected, a story and a half, built from local timber, with a covered porch and stone chimney. The barn, by contrast, was substantial and well-maintained, with fresh paint and sturdy fencing. Several horses grazed in paddocks beyond the barn, and 3 men working near the corrals stopped to watch the wagon approach. Abraham, the older black man Beaumont employed, came out onto the porch as they arrived. He was perhaps 60, with gray hair and the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to navigate complex social situations. His eyes took in Delilah May's arrival with no visible surprise, though he must have heard rumors about what had transpired at the courthouse. "Abraham, this is Mrs. Garrett," Beaumont said, helping Delilah May down from the wagon. "She'll be managing the household from now on. Please show her through the house and help her get settled." "Yes, sir," Abraham replied, his tone neutral. To Delilah May he said, "This way, ma'am." The house's interior surprised her with its orderliness. The main room combined kitchen and sitting area with a simple table, several chairs, and a cast-iron stove that looked recently installed. 2 doors led to smaller rooms, one clearly Beaumont's bedroom, the other a storage area converted into a second sleeping space. Everything was clean but Spartan, the home of someone who spent minimal time indoors. "Mr. Beaumont's gone most weeks," Abraham explained, showing Delilah May around. "He keeps the house simple because he's not here to use much of it. I've been doing the cooking and cleaning, but it's more than one person can manage properly, especially with the horsework as well." Over the next several hours, as Abraham answered her questions and showed her how the property functioned, Delilah May began to understand Beaumont's household. He employed Abraham and the 2 handlers, but the operation was expanding beyond what 3 men could effectively manage. Correspondence piled up unanswered. Financial records existed in fragmentary form across multiple ledgers. The house needed deep cleaning and better organization. Food preparation was adequate but uninspired. In short, Beaumont had been truthful. He needed household management, and Delilah May possessed exactly the skills required. When Beaumont returned that evening, after settling the horses and speaking with his handlers, he found Delilah May at the kitchen table with his ledgers spread before her, making notes on a separate sheet of paper. "You work quickly," he observed, taking a seat across from her. "You have invoices dating back 14 months that haven't been reconciled," she replied without looking up. "And your feed costs are substantially higher than they should be. Either your supplier is overcharging or someone's taking a percentage." Beaumont leaned back in his chair, a slight smile crossing his face. "I knew you'd be useful. We need to discuss the terms of this arrangement more specifically," Delilah May said, finally meeting his eyes. "What you did at the courthouse was legal, but we both know it exists in questionable territory. I need to understand exactly what you expect from me and what I can expect from you." They talked until well after midnight that first night, working out the practical details of their situation. Delilah May would manage all household affairs, keep Beaumont's business records, handle correspondence, and oversee the domestic side of the property. In return, she would have autonomy over those domains, a guaranteed allowance for personal expenses, and the understanding that Beaumont's custody was administrative rather than proprietary. The arrangement was employment, not ownership, regardless of what the courthouse documents technically stated. "And the social situation?" Delilah May asked. "People will talk. They'll assume certain things." "Let them talk," Beaumont said. "I'll be gone most of the time anyway. What matters is that you'll be doing useful work instead of sitting in a parlor waiting for your husband to be embarrassed by your existence." The blunt acknowledgement of her situation with James should have stung, but instead Delilah May felt something close to relief. Beaumont dealt in plain facts, not social pretense. There was freedom in that directness. Over the following weeks, Delilah May transformed Beaumont's household. She implemented systems for record-keeping that made his business finances clear at a glance. She negotiated better prices with suppliers, catching the feed cost irregularity Beaumont had been too busy to notice. She reorganized the house, established proper meal schedules, and began teaching Abraham more sophisticated cooking techniques using recipes from her mother's collection. The physical labor involved in managing a working property, combined with regular meals rather than the afternoon binges that had characterized her life at the Garrett house, began affecting her health. She lost weight gradually but noticeably, and more importantly, she regained the energy and focus that had drained away during her years of confined inactivity. Abraham proved an excellent collaborator. He'd been born enslaved in Kentucky and purchased his freedom in 1845, then worked his way to Texas doing various jobs before Beaumont hired him. His experience navigating social hierarchies made him adept at managing the subtle complexities of their unusual household. He answered curious questions from visitors with polite vagueness and helped Delilah May understand the local networks of commerce and reputation that govern business in Anderson County. Beaumont's 2 handlers, brothers named Curtis and Martin Yarbrough, were initially uncertain about Delilah May's presence, but quickly came to appreciate the improvements in daily operations. They'd been handling their own cooking and domestic needs alongside horsework, and having those responsibilities lifted made their jobs considerably easier. Curtis, the older brother, possessed a gift for training difficult horses. Martin had an eye for bloodlines and conformation that rivaled Beaumont's own expertise. The property began functioning like a proper business rather than a loosely organized operation run by a man who was rarely present. When Beaumont returned from his trading trips, he found detailed reports on expenses, correspondence answered, and decisions made in his absence that consistently proved sound. Palestine society, meanwhile, struggled to categorize what had occurred. The Garrett family name retained enough standing to prevent open scandal, but people whispered. James appeared at agricultural association meetings with the Morgan stallion, which became a topic of admiring conversation. Everyone agreed the horse was magnificent. Fewer people inquired about Mrs. Garrett, and James offered no information. The general understanding, never stated explicitly, was that the marriage had dissolved under circumstances best left unexamined. Delilah May's family in Crockett received a letter from her explaining that her circumstances had changed and that she was now managing a household and business affairs for Mr. Beaumont. The letter's tone suggested employment rather than scandal, and the Thornton family, already somewhat distant from their daughter since her marriage, accepted this explanation without pressing for details. By November 1858, the immediate shock of the courthouse transaction had faded into background gossip, displaced by other concerns. Political tensions about territorial expansion and slavery's future dominated conversation. Palestine continued its cotton-driven prosperity. Life moved forward, absorbing the unusual event the way communities always absorb things that don't fit comfortable categories. But on Beaumont's property, something more significant than a business arrangement was developing. Delilah May discovered that she possessed capabilities beyond household management. She understood horses, not with Beaumont's instinctive sense for breeding and training, but with an analytical mind that could track bloodlines, identify market opportunities, and manage the business side of horse trading with precision Beaumont had never achieved alone. When Beaumont returned from a buying trip to Louisiana in mid-December, Delilah May presented him with a proposal. She'd been corresponding with breeders in Kentucky and Tennessee, researching bloodlines and market prices. She'd identified an opportunity to acquire 3 mares with excellent Morgan heritage at prices below market value, due to an estate sale in Lexington. The investment would be substantial, but the potential return through breeding and sales could transform Beaumont's operation from skilled one-man trading to legitimate breeding business. Beaumont studied her research, asked pointed questions about her analysis, then approved the purchase. "You're thinking bigger than I've been thinking," he said. "That's useful. I've spent 7 years watching my husband fail to think strategically about his plantation," Delilah May replied. "I learned what not to do." The transaction that had begun as Beaumont's revenge on James Garrett was evolving into an actual partnership, one based on mutual benefit and complementary skills rather than the social and romantic foundations that were supposed to govern relationships between men and women in Anderson County society. It was this unexpected development that would make what came next so devastating. The Kentucky mares arrived in late January 1859, transported by rail to Tyler, and then overland to Palestine. They were everything Delilah May's research had promised. 3 females from established Morgan lines, aged 4 to 6 years, with confirmed breeding history and temperament suited to both riding and harness work. The investment had required most of Beaumont's available capital plus a loan from a Tyler bank, arranged using the property as collateral. Curtis and Martin Yarbrough examined the mares with approval, and Beaumont himself spent 2 days assessing conformation and behavior before declaring the purchase sound. The first breeding would occur in spring, and if the bloodlines proved as strong as expected, the resulting foals could command premium prices throughout Texas and beyond. Palestine's horse trading community took notice. Beaumont's operation had been respected but modest. A skilled trader who could find quality animals and train them effectively. The mare purchase signaled something different. Ambition toward breeding stock and long-term business rather than opportunistic trading. Several established breeders viewed this development with interest and some concern about competition. James Garrett heard about the mares through agricultural association conversations and understood immediately where the capital for such a purchase had likely come from. The business acumen he'd dismissed in his former wife was now benefiting the man he'd grown to hate. The Morgan stallion he'd received in the trade grazed in his paddock, impressive to look at, but also a daily reminder of the transaction that had obtained it. In February, James appeared at Beaumont's property unannounced, riding the Morgan stallion. Delilah May was working at the kitchen table with account books when she heard hooves approaching and looked out to see her former husband dismounting in the yard. She met him at the door before he could knock. "What do you want, James?" His eyes took in the changes visible even from the porch. Her reduced size, her direct gaze, the confidence in her posture that had been absent during their marriage. "I want to discuss the terms of our agreement," he said. "There's nothing to discuss. The agreement was executed legally and is final." "I'm prepared to offer new terms," James said. "I'll pay Beaumont double the stallion's value to reverse the arrangement." Delilah May felt something cold settle in her chest. "I'm not a horse that can be traded back and forth at your convenience." "You signed documents giving Beaumont custody," James replied. "That makes you subject to negotiation." "No," Delilah May said simply. "The answer is no. Whatever arrangement you want to propose, discuss it with Mr. Beaumont. I'm telling you now that I won't agree to any reversal." James's face hardened. "You've forgotten your place remarkably quickly." "I've found my place," Delilah May corrected. "And it's not as your wife. Leave, James." He stood there for another moment, clearly wanting to say more, then turned and remounted the Morgan. As he rode away, Delilah May noticed Curtis Yarbrough watching from the barn, having apparently observed the entire exchange. When Beaumont returned that evening from business in Tyler, Delilah May told him about James's visit. Beaumont listened without interrupting, then said, "He'll be back. Men like Garrett can't tolerate losing, especially when the loss becomes public knowledge. The mayor's made it public. Everyone in the county knows where the capital came from. What will you do if he makes a formal offer?" Delilah May asked. "I'll refuse," Beaumont said. "The arrangement we have works. I'm not interested in renegotiating." But James Garrett's appearance had been a reconnaissance rather than a negotiation. What he'd seen at Beaumont's property, the improvements, the organization, the obvious success of the household and business, had confirmed his suspicions about where his former wife's capabilities were now directed. The knowledge festered. Throughout March and April 1859, James began making inquiries around Palestine about the legal status of the courthouse documents. He spoke with attorneys in Tyler and consulted with Judge Patterson about the technical language used in the custody transfer. What he learned frustrated him. The documents were legally sound, if unconventional. Breaking the agreement would require proving either coercion or incompetence, and James himself had publicly asserted Delilah May's free consent at the courthouse. His focus shifted toward Beaumont's business operations. If he couldn't legally reclaim his former wife, he could potentially damage the enterprise she was helping to build. James began spreading rumors about Beaumont's financial situation, suggesting the mare purchase had over-leveraged the property. He questioned the breeding quality of the new stock in conversations with other horse breeders. He made it known that he considered Beaumont's operation unsound and advised against doing business with the horse trader. The campaign was subtle but effective. Several potential buyers who had been considering horses from Beaumont's property decided to look elsewhere. A breeding contract that Curtis Yarbrough had been negotiating for the Morgan stallion fell through after the other party expressed concerns about Beaumont's financial stability. Delilah May recognized the pattern from her years observing plantation society. This was reputation warfare, the kind of social combat that could destroy businesses without any direct confrontation. She brought her concerns to Beaumont in early May. "Garrett's poisoning your business relationships," she said. "We need to counter it directly." "How?" Beaumont asked. "I can't defend against whispers and insinuations." "No," Delilah May agreed. "But we can make the whispers irrelevant by demonstrating success. The mares will foal starting next month. If the bloodlines prove strong, we'll have evidence that overwhelms any rumor." The first foal arrived on June 3, 1859, a filly with the distinctive Morgan build and a coat that matched her sire's deep coloring. Curtis Yarbrough, who handled most of the actual breeding operations, pronounced the foal perfect. The second mare produced a colt, 2 weeks later, equally impressive. The third foaling was expected in early July. Beaumont began receiving inquiries about the foals before they were even weaned. Word of quality bloodlines traveled quickly through horse breeding networks, and physical evidence of successful breeding carried more weight than any rumor about financial stability. James Garrett's campaign of reputation damage appeared to be failing. Then, on July 8, 1859, Delilah May received a letter from her father in Crockett. The letter's tone was formal and cold, quite different from the occasional friendly correspondence they'd maintained since her move to Beaumont's property. Her father wrote that he'd learned details about the courthouse transaction from James Garrett, who had apparently visited Crockett to provide his version of events. The Thornton family was, the letter stated, profoundly disturbed by the circumstances surrounding Delilah May's current situation. Her father demanded that she return to the family home immediately to discuss the matter. Delilah May read the letter twice, feeling the careful trap that had been constructed. James had gone to Crockett not to inform her family out of concern, but to weaponize their reaction. If she refused her father's summons, she would appear to be under Beaumont's improper control. If she complied, she would be subjected to family pressure to leave Beaumont's household and return to respectable society, which, given the circumstances, would likely mean returning to James or accepting some other arrangement her family deemed appropriate. She showed the letter to Beaumont that evening. He read it silently, then handed it back. "Your decision," he said. "But understand that if you go to Crockett, your family will do everything possible to keep you there." "I know," Delilah May said, "which is why I'm going to write my father and explain exactly what our arrangement entails. He deserves the truth, not James's version." The letter Delilah May composed took her 3 days to write properly. She detailed her situation during the final years of her marriage, the isolation, the humiliation, the complete absence of purpose or agency. She explained the courthouse transaction not as a scandal, but as an escape from circumstances her father had never witnessed. She described her current work, the household she managed, the business skills she'd developed. She made clear that Beaumont's custody was administrative partnership, not ownership or inappropriate relationship. Most importantly, she asserted her right to choose this situation over returning to either James or to her father's house, to be managed like an embarrassing problem requiring solution. Her father's response, arriving 2 weeks later, was brief. The family was disappointed in her choices and considered the matter closed. She would receive no further financial support or social acknowledgement from the Thornton family. Her brother would handle any inheritance matters when the time came, but she should not expect familial treatment. Delilah May read this letter alone in the kitchen and allowed herself 15 minutes of grief before returning to the breeding records she'd been updating. She'd lost her family of origin, but she'd gained something they couldn't understand. Work that mattered, skills that had value, partnership based on capability rather than social obligation. The third mare foaled in late July, producing twins, an extremely rare occurrence in horses and one that carried significant risk. Curtis Yarbrough worked through the night to save both foals and their mother. By morning, all 3 had survived, though the twins were small and required careful management. Despite the risk and extra work, the twins represented a marketing opportunity. Matched Morgan foals from quality bloodlines could command extraordinary prices from the right buyers. Delilah May immediately began corresponding with breeders and wealthy horse enthusiasts throughout the South, promoting the unusual birth. By August, Beaumont's operation had shifted from merely profitable to genuinely successful. The original investment in the Kentucky mares had paid for itself through stud fees and advanced sales on the foals. The property's reputation within horse breeding circles had expanded beyond East Texas. Delilah May's business management had transformed what had been skilled individual trading into a legitimate commercial enterprise. James Garrett watched this success with increasing fury. The courthouse transaction he'd agreed to, thinking he was ridding himself of a burden, had instead empowered the very person he'd dismissed as worthless, while simultaneously benefiting his enemy. Every conversation in Palestine about Beaumont's breeding success was an implicit reminder of James's miscalculation. In September 1859, James made one final attempt at direct negotiation. He appeared at Beaumont's property with a formal written proposal, He would pay $3,000, several times the original stallion's value, to reverse the custody arrangement. The document was properly drafted, with spaces for Beaumont's and Delilah May's signatures. Beaumont received him in the yard, not inviting him into the house. Delilah May watched from the porch while Abraham stood nearby, his presence a quiet statement of household solidarity. "I'm not interested in your offer," Beaumont said after reading the proposal. "That's an extraordinary sum," James replied. "More than your entire property is worth." "Nevertheless," Beaumont said, handing back the document, "the arrangement we have suits me perfectly. Mrs. Garrett has proven invaluable to my operations. Why would I give that up?" "She's my wife," James said, his voice rising. "The document said custody, not ownership, which means the arrangement can be modified." "She was your wife," Beaumont corrected, "and the custody arrangement stands as executed. The matter is closed." James looked past Beaumont to where Delilah May stood on the porch. "You actually prefer this? Working like a servant for a horse trader, you could return to proper society. I prefer useful work to decorative confinement," Delilah May replied. "The answer is no, James. It will always be no." James's face went through several emotions before settling on cold rage. "You'll both regret this," he said. "I promise you that." He rode away on the Morgan stallion, his back rigid with fury, and this time everyone present understood that something had shifted. The situation had moved beyond business dispute or social awkwardness into territory where James Garrett's humiliation demanded satisfaction of a different kind. What none of them anticipated was how carefully James had already been preparing that satisfaction, or how far his planning had already progressed. The first indication of real danger came not from James Garrett directly, but from an unexpected quarter. In late September, Abraham mentioned to Delilah May that he'd encountered one of James's enslaved workers at the Palestine market. The man, named Joseph, had approached Abraham privately and delivered a cryptic warning. "Tell Mrs. Garrett to be careful. Mr. James is planning something bad." When pressed for details, Joseph had shaken his head. "I don't know exactly what, but he's been meeting with men from Tyler. Rough men, not planters, and he's been asking questions about Mr. Beaumont's schedule, when he's home, when he's traveling." Delilah May brought this information to Beaumont that evening. His reaction was immediate and serious. "Garrett's hiring violence," he said. "That's what those meetings mean." "For what purpose?" Delilah May asked, though she already suspected the answer. "To destroy what he can't reclaim," Beaumont replied. "If he can't reverse the arrangement legally, he'll eliminate it physically." Over the next 2 weeks, Beaumont made quiet preparations. He spoke with Curtis and Martin Yarbrough about maintaining vigilance around the property. He purchased 2 additional rifles and distributed them among his workers. He varied his travel schedule to make patterns less predictable. Most significantly, he began sleeping in the barn rather than the house, reasoning that any attack would likely target him directly. Nothing happened. The October weeks passed peacefully, with autumn work proceeding normally. The Morgan foals continued growing strong. Several sales contracts were finalized, and Beaumont's breeding reputation continued expanding. The warning from Joseph began to seem like excessive caution, or perhaps even James's attempt at intimidation rather than precursor to actual violence. Then, on the night of October 23, 1859, everything changed. Beaumont had left for Arkansas 3 days earlier, planning to be gone for a week pursuing a buying opportunity. His absence was known throughout Palestine. He'd mentioned the trip at several businesses in town while making preparations. The property's defense therefore fell to Curtis and Martin Yarbrough, Abraham and Delilah May herself. The attack came at 2 in the morning. Delilah May woke to Abraham pounding on her bedroom door, shouting about fire. She emerged to see orange light flickering through the windows. The barn was burning. She ran outside in her nightdress to chaos. The barn's entire west side was engulfed in flames, and she could hear horses screaming inside. Curtis and Martin were already working to open the barn doors and lead animals out, while Abraham had begun hauling water from the well, though everyone knew the fire was already too large to fight effectively. Through the smoke and confusion, Delilah May caught glimpses of figures moving in the darkness beyond the fire's light. At least 3 men on horseback, watching from a safe distance. Not helping, not fleeing, just watching. The next 30 minutes existed in fragments of memory that Delilah May would never fully piece together coherently. Curtis managed to lead 6 horses to safety before the barn's roof began collapsing. 2 of the Kentucky mares and the Morgan Stallion's first filly were trapped inside when the structure fell, their screams cutting off suddenly as burning timber buried them. The other foals survived only because they'd been in a paddock rather than the barn, and Martin managed to lead them away before the fire spread. By the time the barn's roof completely collapsed in a shower of sparks, Delilah May stood in the yard with her face blackened by smoke, watching everything Beaumont had built burn. The 3 riders she'd glimpsed earlier had vanished. Palestine's volunteer fire brigade arrived near dawn, too late to save the barn, but in time to prevent the fire from spreading to the house or other outbuildings. They worked until mid-morning containing the blaze, then stood among the smoking ruins discussing the cause. The fire marshal, a Palestine merchant named Hargrove, made his assessment quickly. "Arson," he said, pointing to scorch marks on the barn's west side. "Someone used accelerant here and here. This wasn't an accident." "Who would do such a thing?" Curtis Yarbrough asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "That's for the sheriff to determine," Hargrove replied. "But whoever did this knew their business. Professional work." The sheriff arrived later that day, interviewed everyone present, examined the remains, and took notes. He asked if anyone had enemies or knew of threats against the property. Delilah May mentioned James Garrett's previous visits and barely veiled threats, but carefully avoided giving the sheriff enough information to understand the full context of their dispute. She knew that explaining the courthouse transaction would undermine rather than support any case against James. "I'll look into it," the sheriff said, in the tone of someone who'd already decided the investigation would lead nowhere. Arson was notoriously difficult to prove without witnesses, and the men Delilah May had glimpsed in the darkness were long gone. Beaumont returned from Arkansas 2 days later to find his barn destroyed, 3 valuable horses dead, and his operation's physical infrastructure severely damaged. He stood in the ruins for a long time without speaking, his face showing no emotion, while Curtis Yarbrough detailed what had happened. When Curtis finished, Beaumont turned to Delilah May. "You saw riders." 3 men on horseback, watching from beyond the fire's light, she confirmed. "They left before the fire brigade arrived." "And the sheriff?" "He took statements and left. I don't think he'll pursue it seriously." Beaumont nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Garrett didn't do this personally. He hired it done, which means there's no proof connecting him to it. He's probably in Tyler or somewhere else with witnesses to establish he wasn't here." "What do we do?" Delilah May asked. "We rebuild," Beaumont said, "and we prepare for the next attempt." Because everyone understood, though no one said it explicitly, that this wouldn't be James Garrett's final move. The barn burning had been revenge, but it had also been a demonstration, proof that James could strike at Beaumont's operation whenever he chose, and that the law wouldn't protect them. The financial damage from the fire was substantial. The barn itself represented significant capital, but the lost horses were even more costly. 2 of the Kentucky mares had died, irreplaceable breeding stock. One of the Morgan foals was gone, along with months of investment in care and training. Insurance, to the extent it existed for such properties in 1859 Texas, didn't cover arson when the perpetrators remained unidentified. Beaumont spent the next week taking inventory of what survived and calculating the cost of rebuilding. The property could recover, but it would require depleting their reserves and likely taking on additional debt. More troubling was the reputation damage. Word of the fire spread quickly through horse breeding circles, and potential buyers began expressing concerns about the stability of Beaumont's operation. James Garrett, meanwhile, made a point of appearing at the Agricultural Association's November meeting with expressions of sympathy for Beaumont's misfortune. He offered condolences on the lost horses, and even suggested that if Beaumont needed to sell any remaining stock to cover rebuilding costs, he would consider purchasing at fair prices. The performance was masterful. James positioned himself as magnanimous neighbor rather than vengeful enemy, and several men present commented on his generous spirit. Only those who understood the full context of the situation recognized the display for what it was, a public assertion of victory. Delilah May watched all this from a distance. through reports from Abraham and the Yarbrough brothers who heard the gossip in Palestine. She spent her days working through Beaumont's finances, trying to find paths toward recovery that didn't require selling their remaining breeding stock at depressed prices. It was during this period of financial crisis that Delilah May discovered something that changed her understanding of their entire situation. She'd been reviewing Beaumont's correspondence files, looking for potential buyers or business contacts who might provide favorable terms for rebuilding loans. Deep in a stack of letters from 1858, before the courthouse transaction, she found an exchange between Beaumont and a horse breeder in Kentucky that referenced James Garrett specifically. The Kentucky breeder had written asking about potential customers in East Texas for Morgan bloodstock. Beaumont's response, dated July 1858, included this paragraph. James Garrett of Palestine has money but lacks judgment in horseflesh. He recently purchased a gelding from me and later complained about a minor defect, demanding refund. I suspect he seeks to establish reputation as difficult customer to negotiate future discounts. I don't recommend him as buyer unless you want trouble. The letter was dated weeks before the famous dispute at the Agricultural Association meeting, which meant the split hoof incident that had supposedly triggered Beaumont's desire for revenge had been known to Beaumont well in advance of their public confrontation. Delilah May sat with the letter for a long time, understanding crystallizing slowly. The horse sale hadn't caused the dispute. Beaumont had known the gelding had a defect and sold it anyway, anticipating James's complaint. The Agricultural Association confrontation hadn't been unexpected insult. It had been a deliberately engineered situation where James would publicly challenge Beaumont to name terms for satisfaction. Everything that followed, the courthouse transaction, the custody arrangement, the building partnership between Beaumont and Delilah May, had been Beaumont's planned response to a situation he'd created intentionally. She'd known their arrangement was partly revenge, but she hadn't realized how carefully Beaumont had orchestrated every step, including the original provocation. When Beaumont returned to the house that evening, Delilah May was waiting with the Kentucky letter on the table between them. "You engineered the entire dispute with James," she said without preamble. "The defective horse, the public confrontation, all of it." Beaumont looked at the letter, then at Delilah May. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I needed household management and business partnership," Beaumont replied. "And you needed escape from a situation that was destroying you. The courthouse transaction accomplished both. You manipulated both of us," Delilah May said. "You created a situation where James would feel compelled to challenge you, knowing you could propose an arrangement he'd be desperate enough to accept." "I created an opportunity," Beaumont corrected. "You chose to take it. So did Garrett. I didn't force either of you to sign those documents." Delilah May felt anger and something else. Grudging respect for the calculation involved, mixed with recognition that Beaumont's manipulation had indeed given her capabilities and purpose she'd lost during her marriage. "What happens now?" she asked. "James burns down your barn, maybe kills us next. Was that part of your planning?" "No," Beaumont admitted. "I underestimated how far Garrett's pride would drive him. That's my miscalculation." They sat in silence for several minutes, the candles burning down between them, both understanding that they'd reached a critical juncture. The partnership they'd built, regardless of how it had been initiated, was now threatened by escalating violence neither of them had anticipated. "We need to end this," Delilah May said finally, "before someone dies." "Agreed," Beaumont replied. "The question is how." What neither of them yet realized was that James Garrett had already decided how their situation would end, and his plan was far more comprehensive than a burned barn. The answer to Beaumont's question arrived 2 weeks later, though not in any form either he or Delilah May anticipated. On November 18, 1859, the Anderson County Sheriff appeared at Beaumont's property with a deputy and a formal warrant. The charge was fraud, specifically misrepresentation in the courthouse transaction of September 1858. James Garrett had filed a complaint alleging that Beaumont had coerced Delilah May into signing the custody documents, that the transaction had been fundamentally fraudulent, and that Beaumont had profited from illegal manipulation of his former wife. The warrant demanded that Beaumont appear at the courthouse for examination by Judge Patterson, with possible criminal charges to follow, depending on the hearing's outcome. The timing was deliberately chosen. Beaumont was scheduled to leave for Louisiana in 2 days for a crucial breeding negotiation, and the hearing would force him to remain in Palestine. "This is absurd," Beaumont said, reading the warrant. Mrs. Garrett signed those documents freely, with the judge present. "That's for the court to determine," the sheriff replied. "The hearing is set for day after tomorrow, 10 in the morning. Don't consider leaving town. That would make things considerably worse." After the sheriff left, Delilah May and Beaumont sat at the kitchen table with the warrant between them, understanding the sophistication of James's strategy. He couldn't prove Beaumont had burned the barn, but he could weaponize the very documents that had made their arrangement legal. By alleging fraud and coercion, James transformed himself from aggrieved party into protector of his former wife's interests. "He'll testify that you manipulated me," Delilah May said, "that I couldn't have freely consented because of my circumstances during our marriage, my isolation, my size, my dependence on him. He'll paint me as victim rather than participant." "Which undermines everything you've accomplished here," Beaumont observed. "If the court accepts that argument, it declares you incompetent to make decisions about your own life." "Exactly," Delilah May said. "Either I was coerced, which makes you a criminal, or I was competent, which makes James look foolish for the original transaction. He's betting the court will find coercion more acceptable than admitting I chose this situation." The hearing 2 days later filled the courthouse with spectators drawn by gossip about the unusual case. James appeared with an attorney from Tyler, a persuasive speaker named Fulton who specialized in property disputes. Beaumont and Delilah May arrived together without legal representation. Beaumont couldn't afford an attorney after the barn fire, and the speed of the hearing had left no time to arrange proper defense. Judge Patterson presided with visible discomfort, clearly wishing this matter had never entered his courtroom. He'd notarized the original documents, which made him partly complicit in whatever had occurred. Fulton opened by painting a picture of Delilah May's situation during her marriage, isolated, humiliated, dependent entirely on her husband's provision. He called James to testify about his former wife's increasing size and withdrawal from society, emphasizing how these factors had made her vulnerable to exploitation. "Mr. Beaumont," Fulton said during his presentation, "identified Mrs. Garrett's weakness and exploited it for his own benefit. He manipulated a vulnerable woman into signing documents that effectively made her his property, all under guise of legal transaction. This is fraud of the worst kind, taking advantage of someone's desperate circumstances for personal gain." When Beaumont's turn came to respond, he had no attorney to filter his words. He stood before Judge Patterson and spoke directly. "Mrs. Garrett signed those documents of her own free will in this courthouse, with you as witness. She's since demonstrated through her work managing my household and business that she's perfectly capable of making sound decisions. The fraud here isn't mine. It's Mr. Garrett's attempt to undo a legal transaction because he's realized it benefited everyone except him." "And what of the custody language?" Judge Patterson asked. "That was unusual phrasing." "It was honest phrasing," Beaumont replied. "I took responsibility for Mrs. Garrett's welfare in exchange for valuable consideration. That's exactly what happened. Whether that makes people uncomfortable is separate from whether it was legal." The hearing continued through the afternoon, with testimony from several witnesses about Delilah May's current situation. Abraham described the household's normal functioning. Curtis Yarbrough discussed her business management. Even Martin, usually quiet, testified that Mrs. Garrett made decisions about the property's operations that were consistently sound. Finally, Judge Patterson called Delilah May herself to testify. She took the stand aware that everything she said would be scrutinized for signs of either coercion or incompetence. "Mrs. Garrett," Judge Patterson said, "did Mr. Beaumont coerce you into signing the September documents?" "No," Delilah May replied clearly. "He presented an option, and I chose to accept it." "Were you aware of the implications of those documents?" "Completely. I understood that I was dissolving my marriage and accepting Mr. Beaumont's custody, which meant, in practical terms, working for him in exchange for household management authority and personal autonomy." "And you considered this preferable to remaining married to Mr. Garrett?" Delilah May looked directly at James before answering. "I spent 3 years confined to a house, treated as an embarrassment my husband couldn't solve. Mr. Beaumont offered me useful work and respect for my capabilities. Yes, I considered and still consider that preferable." Fulton attempted to undermine her testimony with questions about her emotional state during the marriage, her isolation, her dependence. But Delilah May answered each question with calm precision, making clear that she'd chosen her current situation not from desperation but from recognition that it offered better opportunities than her marriage had provided. When the testimony concluded, Judge Patterson adjourned the hearing to consider his decision. The courthouse emptied slowly, with spectators discussing what they'd heard in hushed groups. Beaumont and Delilah May returned to the property to wait. 2 days passed with no word from the court. Then 3 days. The uncertainty stretched into a full week, while life on the property continued with the artificial normalcy of people waiting for judgment. On the 8th day, a courier arrived with Judge Patterson's written decision. Beaumont read it first, his expression unreadable, then handed it to Delilah May. The ruling was careful and technical. Judge Patterson found no evidence of coercion in the September 1858 transaction. The documents had been signed freely by competent parties with full understanding of their implications. However, and this was the critical point, the judge declared the custody language inappropriate and potentially invalid under Texas marriage law. His solution was to effectively dissolve the custody arrangement while leaving the marriage dissolution intact. Delilah May was declared a free woman, neither married to James Garrett nor under Beaumont's custody. Any continued relationship between Beaumont and Delilah May would need to be structured as standard employment rather than the unusual custody framework. The decision satisfied no one. James had failed to prove fraud, but he'd succeeded in undermining the legal framework of Beaumont's arrangement. Beaumont retained Delilah May's work, but lost the formal custody that had protected the situation from certain kinds of social criticism. Delilah May gained explicit legal independence, but lost the documentary protection the custody arrangement had provided. Most significantly, the ruling left open questions about what would happen next. The barn was still burned. The breeding operation remained financially stressed. And James Garrett, having failed to achieve complete victory through legal means, now faced a choice about whether to escalate further. The answer came on November 30th, when Curtis Yarbrough discovered 3 of their remaining mares dead in their paddock, poisoned with something that had been mixed into their feed. The poisoning was precise. Only the breeding mares were affected, not the ordinary stock or the foals. This time there was no ambiguity about the target. Someone was systematically destroying Beaumont's breeding operation, horse by horse, attack by attack. And everyone involved knew who was responsible, even if proof remained elusive. Beaumont stood in the paddock among the dead mares, his face finally showing the anger he'd suppressed through months of escalating conflict. "He won't stop," he said to Delilah May. "Not until he's destroyed everything, or we're dead. Then we need to finish this ourselves," Delilah May replied. "Because the law won't do it for us." What she proposed over the next several hours would have shocked anyone who'd known her as James Garrett's isolated, humiliated wife. But the woman who'd emerged from that isolation had learned something crucial from her months managing Beaumont's business. Power came from understanding what people valued and being willing to threaten it. James Garrett valued his reputation above everything else. His standing in Anderson County society, his position in the Agricultural Association, his membership in the Masonic Lodge. These defined his identity more than his actual wealth or property. The courthouse transaction had damaged that reputation, and his subsequent legal efforts had failed to restore it. Delilah May knew things about James that no one else did. 7 years of marriage had given her intimate knowledge of his business practices, his financial arrangements, and most importantly, his secrets. She'd kept silent about these matters, partly from lingering loyalty, partly from understanding that exposing them would reflect badly on her as well. But now, facing systematic destruction of everything she'd built, she reconsidered that silence. "I can destroy him," she told Beaumont. "Not his property, his reputation, everything he values." "How?" Beaumont asked. What Delilah May had discovered during her marriage, through overheard conversations and documents James had carelessly left accessible, was that James Garrett's plantation operated through illegal labor practices that even by 1859 standards were shocking. He'd been purchasing enslaved workers from the banned African trade through intermediaries in Louisiana, something explicitly forbidden by both federal and Texas law since 1808. The documentation existed, bills of sale with dates that proved the origin of several workers who'd appeared on the Garrett property during Delilah May's marriage. Exposing this would destroy James socially and legally. He'd face criminal charges, lose his position in every organization that mattered, and quite possibly lose his property through legal forfeiture. The scandal would make the courthouse transaction look trivial by comparison. "That's dangerous information to release," Beaumont said after Delilah May explained. "It could implicate you as well. You were married to him when some of those transactions occurred." "I have documentation proving I knew nothing about it until after the fact," Delilah May replied. "James was careful to keep those particular business matters hidden from me. But I found his records, and I kept my own copies." She'd done so originally as insurance, a way to protect herself if James ever decided to discard her completely. Now that insurance became a weapon. The question was whether to actually use it. Exposing James would end his attacks, but it would also create a scandal that would touch everyone involved. Beaumont's reputation would survive. He was already outside respectable society. But Delilah May would forever be known as the woman who destroyed her former husband's life, and that reputation would follow her regardless of how justified the revelation might be. They debated through the night, weighing options and consequences. By morning, they'd reached a decision, not to expose James publicly, but to threaten exposure privately, and see if that threat would be sufficient to end his campaign. Beaumont drafted a letter that laid out exactly what Delilah May knew about James's illegal labor purchases, including specific dates, amounts, and the Louisiana intermediaries involved. The letter concluded with a straightforward proposition. James would cease all attacks on Beaumont's property and leave them both alone, or the information would be delivered to the federal marshal in Tyler and to every newspaper in East Texas. Curtis Yarbrough delivered the letter to the Garrett plantation personally, handing it to James in front of his house with explicit instructions to read it immediately. James read the letter, his face going through visible transformations as he understood what Delilah May was threatening. When he finished, he looked up at Curtis and said simply, "Tell Beaumont I understand." For 3 weeks, nothing happened. No more attacks, no legal maneuvering, no contact at all. Life on Beaumont's property slowly returned to normal operations. The dead mares were replaced through purchases that depleted their remaining reserves. Rebuilding the barn began with lumber purchased on credit. The Morgan foals continued their development, and breeding contracts were cautiously negotiated. James Garrett appeared at Agricultural Association meetings, but avoided any mention of Beaumont or the courthouse transaction. He interacted with other planters on normal business matters, his behavior giving no indication of the threat hanging over him. To those watching from outside, it seemed the conflict had simply exhausted itself. But those directly involved understood the precarious balance that had been achieved. James held back by threat of exposure. Beaumont and Delilah May protected by knowledge they possessed, but couldn't safely reveal without destroying themselves as well. And this stalemate, fragile and unsatisfying to everyone, was how the situation stood when winter arrived in Anderson County, bringing cold rain and the kind of gray skies that matched everyone's mood about how things had been resolved. The final chapter of the story unfolded not through dramatic confrontation, but through gradual transformation of all parties involved. Beaumont's breeding operation rebuilt slowly through 1860 and 1861. The barn was reconstructed by early spring, larger and better ventilated than before. The replacement mares proved productive, and the Morgan foals developed into impressive young horses that commanded good prices despite the increasing political tensions consuming the nation's attention. By late 1861, the property had recovered most of what the barn fire and poisoning had destroyed. Delilah May's role in this recovery was substantial and increasingly public. She no longer operated from behind household management, but began attending horse sales and breeding exhibitions personally, representing Beaumont's business interests when he traveled. The unusual nature of their arrangement, woman managing a horse trader's commercial operations, attracted curiosity, but her demonstrable competence gradually overcame social skepticism. The judge's ruling that dissolved the custody framework had actually freed Delilah May to operate more independently. Without the legal ambiguity of custody, she could present herself as Beaumont's business partner and household manager, roles that, while unusual, were at least comprehensible within existing social categories. Several other women in Anderson County who managed family businesses began seeking her advice on financial matters, creating connections Delilah May had never possessed during her marriage. James Garrett, meanwhile, retreated into increasingly rigid conventionality. He married again in summer 1860, a young woman from Tyler whose family connections enhanced his social standing. He continued serving in the Agricultural Association and maintained his plantation operations with meticulous attention to propriety. To external observers, he appeared to have successfully moved past the scandal of the courthouse transaction. But those who knew him better recognized changes. His judgments became more cautious, his business dealings more conservative. He avoided any situation that might attract scrutiny or controversy. The threat of exposure Delilah May held over him had transformed him from aggressive social climber into someone constantly managing potential risk. The Morgan stallion he'd received in the original transaction remained in his paddock, a daily reminder of the exchange that had defined all their fates. James never bred the horse or sold it, keeping it instead like a trophy whose meaning had become increasingly ambiguous over time. When Texas seceded in February 1861 and war became inevitable, all three principals in the courthouse transaction faced its consequences. Beaumont continued horse trading, but now dealt primarily with Confederate military buyers who needed quality stock for cavalry and artillery. The work was profitable but carried risks. Travel became more dangerous, and military authorities sometimes requisitioned horses at prices below market value. James joined the Confederate militia as an officer, leveraging his social position into a captain's commission. He served primarily in administrative roles, managing supply logistics rather than seeing combat. His new wife ran the plantation during his absences, relying on overseer management that proved less effective than James's direct supervision. Delilah May kept Beaumont's business functioning throughout the war years, managing increasingly complex arrangements as Union blockades and Confederate currency problems disrupted normal commerce. She developed barter networks that allowed them to acquire necessary supplies, and she negotiated with military authorities on horse requisitions with skill that often secured better terms than forced seizure would have provided. The war years created opportunities for women to assume business roles that peacetime society would have denied them, and Delilah May used those opportunities to fully establish herself as a legitimate commercial figure in Anderson County. By 1863, people referred to Beaumont's operation with the understanding that Delilah May managed much of its daily functioning. The threatened exposure of James's illegal labor practices never occurred. Delilah May kept the documentation carefully preserved, but the chaos of war made such revelations seem less significant than simple survival. Moreover, as her own position stabilized, the weapon lost some of its appeal. Using it would create scandal that might touch her as well, and she no longer needed that level of destruction to protect herself. James appeared to understand this calculation, and the fragile truce between them solidified into something more permanent. They avoided each other when possible, and maintained cold courtesy when circumstances required interaction. The courthouse transaction became an acknowledged but unmentioned piece of Anderson County history, the kind of scandal people knew about, but didn't discuss in polite company. Beaumont himself changed least among the principals. He continued traveling for horse trading, returning to Palestine with quality stock, and trusting Delilah May with management during his absences. His business flourished despite war disruptions, partly because military demand for horses remained constant, and partly because Delilah May's management proved more effective than his own solo operations had ever been. The partnership they'd begun through manipulation and revenge had evolved into something genuine. Mutual respect based on complementary skills and shared interest in the business's success. Whether it would be characterized as friendship, business association, or something more complex was unclear, and perhaps irrelevant. It worked, which was what mattered to both of them. When the war ended in spring 1865, Anderson County faced its own reconstruction. Confederate currency became worthless, requiring all business arrangements to be renegotiated. Federal occupation brought new authorities and regulations. The plantation economy that had structured society began its slow collapse as slavery ended and labor relationships had to be completely reimagined. James Garrett's plantation struggled through this transition. His Confederate officer service made him subject to initial federal scrutiny, though he faced no serious charges. The labor force he'd built through questionable means dispersed as freedom came, and rebuilding with paid workers proved more expensive and less efficient than his previous operations. His social position, so carefully cultivated before the war, meant less in the changed circumstances of Reconstruction Texas. Beaumont's operation, by contrast, adapted relatively smoothly. Horse breeding and trading continued under similar economic principles, regardless of political changes. The business Delilah May had helped build functioned on commercial relationships rather than enslaved labor, making transition easier. They sold horses to federal cavalry units at the same prices they'd charged Confederates, indifferent to political loyalties in favor of reliable customers. By 1867, nearly a decade after the courthouse transaction, the situation had reached a kind of final resolution. James Garrett remained a diminished but respectable planter, his reputation intact enough to function in county society, but lacking the prominence he'd once possessed. His second marriage produced 3 children, giving him the family he'd wanted. He never again attempted to reverse or challenge the September 1858 documents. Delilah May emerged as a recognized business figure in Anderson County, unusual but no longer scandalous. She continued managing Beaumont's operations with increasing authority, eventually negotiating major breeding contracts with buyers throughout the South and beyond. Her weight stabilized at a healthy level, and she regained the energy and confidence she'd lost during her marriage. She never remarried, finding the independence of her current situation preferable to conventional domestic arrangements. Beaumont built his breeding operation into one of the most successful in East Texas, with reputation extending well beyond Anderson County. He continued his itinerant lifestyle, traveling for business and leaving daily management to Delilah May and their expanded staff. The partnership that had begun as revenge scheme became a model for effective business collaboration, though its unusual origins ensured it would never be replicated by others. The barn fire and mare poisoning were never officially solved. The perpetrators, whoever they might have been, disappeared into the general chaos of war years, and by the time relative peace returned, pursuing justice for events from 1859 seemed less important than managing present challenges. Abraham remained with the household through all these changes, transitioning from enslaved worker to paid employee after emancipation, and continuing in his role as household manager and informal advisor to both Beaumont and Delilah May. His presence provided continuity through all the transformations the property underwent. The courthouse documents that had created so much controversy were eventually filed deep in Anderson County archives, where they remained as curious historical artifacts. Occasionally, researchers examining county records from the antebellum period would discover them and puzzle over the unusual custody language and the circumstances that had produced such an arrangement. By 1870, when the federal census recorded Anderson County's population and property, all 3 principals in the courthouse transaction appeared in their separate listings. James Garrett as planter and farmer, Silas Beaumont as horse breeder, and Delilah May Garrett, still using her married name despite the dissolved marriage, as business manager. The census taker noted no special circumstances about any of them. The story might have ended there, relegated to minor county gossip and eventually forgotten as participants died and memory faded. But Delilah May, with her habit of documenting important events, had kept detailed records of everything that had occurred from September 1858 forward. She compiled these records into a leather-bound journal, not for publication but for her own understanding of how her life had been transformed. The journal remained in her possession until her death in 1891, when it passed to one of James Garrett's daughters by his second marriage. Delilah May had maintained cordial if distant relationships with James's children, particularly the girls. The journal eventually found its way to the Anderson County Historical Society, where it was preserved among other documents from Palestine's 19th century history. Modern readers encountering the courthouse transaction through Delilah May's journal and the archived legal documents struggle to categorize what occurred. Was it human trafficking? Probably not by the legal definitions of the time, though it certainly involved treating a woman as property in ways modern sensibilities find disturbing. Was it fraud? Judge Patterson ruled it wasn't, though Beaumont's deliberate manipulation of circumstances troubles contemporary understanding of consent. What emerges most clearly from the historical record is that all three principals, James, Delilah May, and Beaumont, made choices within the constraints and opportunities available to them in Anderson County, Texas, in the late 1850s. Some of those choices were admirable, others deeply questionable. The consequences rippled through their lives and community in ways none of them fully anticipated. The Morgan stallion James received in the exchange lived until 1872, producing numerous foals that carried his bloodline throughout Texas horsebreeding circles. Descendants of those horses can still be found in modern Morgan registries, their pedigrees traceable back to the animal that was traded for a woman's custody on a September morning in Palestine. Whether the story represents justice, exploitation, liberation, revenge, or some combination of all these things remains subject to interpretation. What is certain is that it happened exactly as the courthouse documents and Delilah May's journal record it, a transaction that challenged every assumption about how Southern society functioned and how people within that society negotiated power, dignity, and survival. The leather-bound deed that started everything remains in the Anderson County Historical Society's restricted archives, requiring special permission to examine. The handwriting is still clear, the signatures distinct, the terms unambiguous. 4 witnessed signatures on a legal document, 1 purebred Morgan stallion, and a woman who became property in the eyes of the law, then used that impossible situation to build something better than what she'd lost.